Government close by is more likely to respond to local needs and to mirror local values than government in a remote location. The Principle of the Republican Government by Joerg Knipprath. Melancton Smith is not a household name when considering the adoption of the Constitution, but he was well known to the members of the crucial 1788 New York Ratifying Convention. Through his writings, his ideas became well known beyond his state, even if his name did not. In the convention, Smith was aligned with Governor George Clinton, Aaron Burr, and the upstate Albany faction against John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and the downstate New York City faction. Clinton was a wily politician and powerful political figure in the state and later in the country. He was also a prominent and effective anti-Federalist leader who traditionally has been thought to be the writer of a series of anti-Federalist essays appearing under the pseudonym Cato. Smith, too, was a prolific critic of the proposed Constitution. Indeed, he was such an effective advocate in the state ratifying convention for the opponents of the Constitution that Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists felt obliged to respond to his challenges and criticisms. Smith had been a lawyer and was a merchant, so his style was logical and his substantive critique was moderate and pragmatic. He appears to have been the author of a series of anti-Federalist essays previously attributed to the Virginian Richard Henry Lee and published anonymously under the name, quote, Letters from a Federal Farmer to the Republican, end quote. Like the essays by Cato, George Clinton, and Brutus attributed to Judge Robert Yates, those of the Federal Farmer posed a real threat to the adoption of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton replied to them directly by name in numbers 67 and 68 of the Federalist, the only anti-Federalist authors whom he named expressly. But there was a difference. With some justification, Hamilton considered the Cato essays to be the work of political expedience, and Governor Clinton to be swayed by personal concerns about looming restriction on the powers of state governments should the Constitution be adopted. He castigated Cato as presenting deliberate falsifications of the constitutional structure of the executive branch. Falling into passages of purple prose at times, Hamilton singled out Cato as an example. Quote, This bold experiment upon the discernment of his countrymen has been hazarded by the writers who, whatever may be his real merit, has had no inconsiderable share of the applauses of his party, and who, upon this false and unfounded suggestion, has built a series of observations equally false and unfounded, end quote. By contrast, the Federal Farmer received reluctantly some faint praise. Hamilton noted that the method of selecting the president had received little criticism. Referring specifically to Federal Farmer, he wrote, quote, The most plausible of these, who has appeared in print, has even deigned to admit that the election of the president is pretty well guarded, end quote. Smith eventually broke rank with the anti-Federalist opposition and voted in favor of the Constitution for practical reasons. By the time the convention voted, the requisite 9 states had already approved it, so the Articles of Confederation had been supplanted. Then the Virginia Convention, where the result had been uncertain, voted narrowly to approve the Constitution. Virginia was the largest and wealthiest state. With Virginia out, there was reason to believe that the Constitution ultimately was not viable as a plan of union. With Virginia committed to the new charter, New York's hand was forced, Smith believed. His defection helped the Constitution's supporters gain a crucial 30 to 27 favorable vote, although the price was a letter that listed 25 proposed provisions in a Bill of Rights and 31 amendments to the Constitution to be addressed through a second, quote, General Convention, end quote, which never materialized. Particularly because he was such a voice of moderation, Smith's concerns about the threat of a faraway general government to the liberty of the people struck a chord. Moreover, his warnings were closely tied to the historical perceptions of Americans regarding Great Britain, including the charge that the people's complaints would fall on the deaf ears with a distant government, that such a government would tax and control them in ways that the people could not support, and recalling sentiments from the Declaration of Independence that such government would send in, quote, an innumerable swarm of officers to infest our country and consume our substance, end quote. Finally, his criticism simply, quote, made sense, end quote. Government close by is more likely to respond to local needs and to mirror local values than government in a remote location. It was a self-evident truth to classic Republican writers that republics were homogeneous, with many shared traits and values among the people, and small in area and population. Although republics could be larger than pure democracies and exercise self-government through the principle of representation, the sacrifice that civic virtue often demanded under either system was rooted in notions of friendship and cultural affinity. Social science research has shown that the larger and more diverse the population of a polity is, the less civic engagement occurs. The result is that a ruling elite becomes distant from the general population, and self-government becomes a cherished fiction, a platonic, quote, noble lie, end quote, more theoretical than real. Such homogeneity and small size have potential downsides of provincialism and inflexibility of a, quote, small town, end quote, staidness. But there is a limit to the size of what truly could be characterized as a community. Anti-Federalist writers made much of this connection among size, cultural affinities, civic virtue, and Republican government. They repeatedly invoked the danger of, quote, consolidation, end quote, under the new Constitution. That is, the fusion of the states into a single large unitary government, an empire designed to become tyrannical. As Melancton Smith warned, that process of effective abolition of the state constitutional systems would not be a sudden event. Rather, it would be gradual but irresistible and inevitable as the general government grew and expanded its powers ever more intrusively into traditionally local matters. Quote, these liberties will not be violently wrested from the people. They will be undermined and gradually consumed, end quote. The potency of this Republican challenge to the Constitution created an urgency for the Charter's supporters to respond vigorously. They used several arguments. Federalist writers commonly pointed to the limited powers which the Constitution vested in the general government, in contrast to what they described as the vast reserved powers of the states. For example, James Madison used this tactic in The Federalist, number 45. The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers of the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the eternal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state, end quote. Another approach was to emphasize the effect of the natural rivalries of politicians fostered by the horizontal separation of powers in the structure of federalism. In the classic essay number 45, The Federalist, James Madison presented as a key feature of the Constitution the simultaneous separation and blending of powers in a system that guarded against oppressive government, not by a myopic focus on civic virtue, but on structures that enabled, quote, ambition to counteract ambition, end quote. Quote, in a single republic, such as the several states, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, state, and national, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people, that different governments will control each other, at the same time that each will be controlled by itself." End quote. Still another was to go on the offensive and to point out that even most American states at this time barely qualified as classic republics in view of their large territorial spread and population, and to note concurrently that the state constitutions lacked various protections so dear to Anti-Federalist writers. As to the size of republics, Anti-Federalists cited Montesquieu, but Hamilton rejoined in number 9 of the Federalist that, quote, "the standards he had in view were of dimensions far short of the limits of every one of these states. Neither Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, nor Georgia can by any means be compared with the models from which he reasoned, and to which the terms of his description apply." End quote. As to protections of liberty, Hamilton objected in the Federalist number 84, quote, "the most considerable of the remaining objections is that the plan of the convention contains no Bill of Rights. Among other answers given to this, it has been on different occasions remarked that the constitution of several of the states are in a similar predicament. I add that New York is of the number. And yet the persons who in this state oppose the new system, while they profess an unlimited admiration for our particular constitution, are among the most intemperate partisans of a Bill of Rights." End quote. In similar vein, Madison asserted that the danger of factions, the bête noire of Republican belief, was much greater in the states than in the Union. Waxing metaphorical, he insisted in number 10 of the Federalist, quote, "the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage of paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project, will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union, when a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is likely to taint a particular county or district, than an entire state. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the disease most incident to Republican government." End quote. Finally, the Federalists pointed out the psychological tendency of voters to connect with local politicians. Hamilton described this in number 17 of the Federalist, quote, "it is a known fact in human nature that its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of the object. Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than his neighbor, to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias toward their local governments than towards the government of the Union." End quote. Madison echoed that analysis in number 46 of the Federalist and challenged Smith's assertion that the new government would infest the country with swarms of bureaucrats. Quote, "many considerations, besides those suggested on a former occasion, seem to place it beyond doubt that the first and most natural attachment of the people will be to the governments of their respective states. Into the administration of these, a greater number of individuals will expect to rise. From the gift of these, a greater number of offices and emoluments will flow. With the affairs of these, the people will be more familiarly and minutely conversant, and with the members of these will a greater proportion of the people have the ties of personal acquaintance and friendship, and of family and party attachments." End quote. It is notable that the defenders of the Constitution at the time agreed that a distant government had systemic tendencies toward unresponsiveness and autocracy. They sought to blunt that criticism by defending their new, quote, confederated republic, end quote. As noted above, a significant part of that defense was that the general government's powers were few and directed at truly, quote, national concerns, which would arise in only unusual and occasional situations, whereas the states would deal with the everyday matters most directly and closely affecting the people. In hindsight, a fair observation is that many of the alarms of the Anti-Federalist raised about an intrusive and overweening central government have materialized. The Federalist responses often appear quaint and unrealistic, perhaps even utopian, in light of events. Their own perceptions of human nature must have alerted them to the weakness of their positions and the veracity of the objections of calm and pragmatic critics such as Smith. That said, Madison, Hamilton, and the other Federalists were not disinterested commentators. They were intent on completing their project of adopting the Constitution. As well, just because the Anti-Federalists appear prescient in their criticisms of the national government does not mean that their confidence in the Republican attributes of state governments would have resulted in less control or regimentation of people's lives. States and localities, in fact, do control the main of people's lives, just as the Federalists argued. Can it really be said that many state governments have not also, quote, undermined and gradually consumed, end quote, the liberties of the people? That those governments have not created, quote, an innumerable swarm of officers to infest our country and consume our substance, end quote? And that the people have not become, quote, subject to impositions which they cannot support, and of which their complaints can never reach the government, end quote. We live in a country nearly 100 times the population and 4 times the area of the United States when the Constitution was adopted. The principle of subsidiarity espoused by Melancton Smith in a Republican Constitution has the virtues of more direct popular participation and influence, more efficient implementation of political decisions, better reflection across broader domain of the diversity of local values and needs, and hence more immediate claims to political legitimacy. The many commentators on effective self-government who have warned over the centuries about the practical limits of republics in terms of area, population size, and cultural heterogeneity were keen observers of political systems. A devolution of more power away from the national government to the states, and from the states to the localities, well might be consistent with better Republican government. Yet, with many current cities and metropolitan areas, each succeeding the entire population of the United States in 1787, there will be further questions about how realistic it is today to expect Republican government in anything but name, even at the local level. Benjamin Franklin's challenge remains when he said about the nature of the government under the Constitution, quote, a republic if you can keep it, end quote. Joerg W. Knipprath is an expert on constitutional law and member of the Southwestern Law School faculty, and he is a Constituting America Fellow. Thank you for joining us today. I am Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. I and Kathy Gillespie, Constituting America's CEO, welcome you to our 13th annual study. These studies are called 90 plus 90 equals 180. History holds the key to the future. Be sure to share the word about this wonderful study about America's founding principles through email, text, phone calls, social media, and do check out last year's study on American exceptionalism. Because when you say America's exceptional and someone else says, no, it's not, prove it. Last year's study gives you 90 essays, a great topic of discussion about why and how America is exceptional. Have a wonderful day. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.